Hello, I'm Todd Phillips, the editor of Canadian Auto Dealer. We're here today with Darren Slind. Darren is the president and co-founder of the Clarify Group. It's a consultancy firm with a specialization in automotive, and they've just released some new research about the importance of auto shows on the consumer purchase journey. So, Darren, thanks for joining us today.
You're very welcome, Todd.
So let's dive in, but before we do that, let's maybe give us a bit of a background about Clarify and your work with auto shows to help set the context, if you will, for some of the findings.
Yeah, the Clarify team has been in existence now for almost 5 years. And over the last 3 years, we've actually been engaged pretty heavily in the auto show space, particularly after the pandemic when the auto shows were resuming across Canada. And so we started with the Canadian International Auto Show in 2023 and then expanded to include the Montreal Salon d'Auto in 2024. And then in 2025, we added the Vancouver Elevate show. And this year in 2026, we'll be adding the Quebec City show. And this is in addition to the work that we're also doing in the United States with the New York International Auto Show and the Los Angeles International Auto Show. And that work is quite specific. We're doing visitor experience research, so independent, arm's length from the auto show itself and from the brands that are exhibiting there to really understand what's driving the visitor experience, and particularly so, what happens at, during, and after the auto show in terms of consumer behavior. In other words, is the auto show creating consumer behavior that both the manufacturers and dealers care about? So what does that actually mean in terms of numbers? Well, we're talking about nearly 11,000 visitors that gave us their feedback during the 2025 Auto Show circuit. That's the combination of the Canadian show in Toronto as well as Montreal and Vancouver. So there's a lot of voices, and it allows us to really understand how the shows themselves are driving consumer behavior.
And I guess there was some fear, I suppose, after the pandemic as we were all adjusting to our new digital work at home, remote environment and more experiential that people might lose interest in these in-person shows. But as you say from the research across all these shows, and it's really spanning really North America, if you will, Clarify has become the de facto researcher for many of these auto shows. That's not the case at all. People are, craving and leaning into the experience, right?
Absolutely. The data is very consistent across all of these North American shows. A couple of interesting points. Nearly 2 in 5 consumers are coming to the show for the express purpose of trying to decide what their next vehicle is. And the other thing that we found that's very consistent across shows is the number of younger consumers. And you think that, at least the traditional wisdom, is that younger consumers, being far more digital, are less interested in these kinds of in-person events. And yet we're seeing the number of visitors at each show that are under the age of 40 is right around one third of all visitors. And when you measure their engagement at the show, their likelihood to recommend the auto show to their family and friends, of all the age categories, and this was counterintuitive, and yet we see it across every show, it is the younger generation, particularly the Gen Zs in Canada, that are the most enthusiastic about recommending the auto show. So clearly, while they're getting information digitally, it's the auto show and that experiential element of being on site and potentially driving these vehicles on one of the test tracks. It's that combination that is really resonating with consumers and with younger consumers in particular.
Well, I guess that's really a good news story because for auto shows, it's not just the older folks going back reminiscent of, the auto enthusiasts. It's another generation that are finding value out of the experience, recommending it. So if you think about the continuity or the ongoing viability of shows, and certainly for dealers who are trying to ensure that next generation are as excited about automobiles as their current consumers, that's probably both a surprising and a good news finding, I think, for shows and for dealers.
It is, and when we dig into the data even a little bit further, one of the interesting statistics is that we're talking about the show attracting in-market buyers. And so we actually quantify that. Those buyers or those consumers who tell us they are in the market in the next 12 months, so they're well down the purchase funnel, they're starting to form their short lists and so on, that represents 33%. If I average across Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver shows, it's 1 in 3 consumers is in that 12-month window. And if we extend that out to a 24-month window, in other words, folks that might just be starting to come into the purchase funnel at the top and starting to think about what might be next for them, that number grows to 60%. So while it's true that there are some portion of visitors to the show that are there primarily for its entertainment value, and there's lots for them to see and do at the show, the bulk of consumers are in fact in the market. And the really interesting finding that we, when you compare that 33% who are in market next 12 months to general surveys of Canadians, and when they are likely to be in market, that number is closer to 13 or 14%. So you're talking about auto show consumers being over twice as likely to be in the market for a new car than the average person on the street. So, when you think about that many consumers that are at some point in the purchase funnel, and then you consider what's really happening in the marketplace, right? We're talking about vehicles that are ever more complex, software-defined vehicles, connected vehicles, electrified powertrains, all of that going on. And at the same time, we're seeing vehicle pricing reach record levels. And so affordability and the fear perhaps of making a suboptimal decision given how much they're going to spend on their next new vehicle, all of these things are contributing to people coming to the show, seeking to be educated, seeking to experience these vehicles so that they're making a good decision.
There's also, the shows obviously are trying to line up as more OEMs or as many of them to participate in the shows, and there's always, eyebrows raised when a high-profile OEM is missing, and beyond sort of that impact, you actually have some research about what happens to a brand in terms of maybe consideration if an OEM is missing from a show. So what does the research say? What do the numbers show about if someone doesn't show up or decides to skip an important show?
It's actually quite fascinating when we look at the numbers. The good news is the vast majority of brands and manufacturers are now represented at the auto shows across North America. But when we look at the impact of brands who actively exhibit versus the brands who do not, and keep in mind, we're measuring the responses from all visitors, and we know what vehicles those visitors own, so we're able to take a look at the impact on each of those brands, whether they're exhibitors or non-exhibitors. And a couple of interesting stats leap out, and I would argue the numbers are not great for the non-exhibitors. There is over twice the likelihood, if you are an exhibiting brand, that you will grow your active consideration relative to your current market share. In other words, you'll be adding prospects to the list that give you the opportunity potentially to grow market share. The reverse is also true. It's actually more than twice as likely that you will decline in overall consideration by more than twice the average brand if you are not present at the show. In other words, out of sight, out of mind. And of course, the risk is you're potentially gifting consideration to your competitors that are at the show, not only for your own owners who are coming to see what is latest and greatest in your product line and you're not there, but also other consumers that don't own your brand that might have considered that are now less likely to. And in fact, in the US studies, the LA study and the New York study, we specifically captured some quantitative data there that did the absence of certain brands have an impact on your show experience? And the answer was yes, and it wasn't a positive outcome. About 75% said it negatively impacted their show experience. But more importantly for the brands is that the consumer was far less likely to consider a non-exhibiting brand. I don't have the statistic memorized, but it is something like 25% lower likelihood to consider than a brand who exhibited.
It's probably even more important. I mean, like you talked earlier about sort of the complex new vehicle powertrains, EVs coming, and for for brands that are introducing new models, new electrification, whether it's plug-in hybrid or full BEV, there's a lot of curiosity at these shows because these are new technologies and people are quite curious about them. So I know you've done some specific EV intender analysis and measuring people's experience at the test track and such. So what are you finding about sort of the Canadian curiosity now? Demand might be slow at the moment or slowing a little bit for EV purchases for a host of reasons, but overall that sort of, can auto show curiosity in these new models. How high is it and what does the profile of those visitors look like on the EV front?
Well, there's no doubt that a key function, a key role of the auto show is to help educate consumers. As you say, with the complexity of the different powertrains and technologies that are coming to market. One of the key questions that we ask is before coming to the show, what is your level of familiarity with electrified vehicles? And it's very interesting. We do see some variation across the country. I think it would be fair to say in Montreal and in Vancouver, overall EV awareness is a little bit higher than it is in Toronto. But we're still talking about the vast minority of consumers that feel comfortable with electrified vehicles. Somewhere in the order of 25 to 30% would describe themselves as being very familiar with EVs. Well, that means the vast majority of show visitors are still learning. Many of them are curious, and many of them do participate, whether it's an indoor or an outdoor experiential test track. And when we ask them the likelihood after experiencing that vehicle on a test track, are they more likely to actively consider? It's very strongly positive. It's driving consideration because their comfort level with a different powertrain that maybe they've never experienced before is now, they're much more comfortable with it.
One last point about what you see the big picture, because one thing is attendance has been up. I mean, historic number. There've been some historic attendance. Not last year in Toronto, there was a massive snowstorm and such that might have dampened that. But previous to that, we were looking at record-breaking attendance at shows. I think Vancouver and others. So people are coming back. So there's obviously that raw number. But with this lens that you have, if you will, across all of these auto shows, you've got the data of Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver, uh, New York, and LA, I guess. So from that macro lens, what are you seeing kind of just one real takeaway for dealers, I guess, in terms of what's happening at that lens in terms of the consumer interest in their products?
Well, if you go back to our earlier conversation about how many visitors are in fact in the purchase funnel, we then take that one step further and we ask them either during or immediately after the show, have they or will they imminently go online to learn more? And the answer is yes. Over 60% of consumers who tell us they're in the 12-month window will in fact go online. To what degree are you likely or have you visited a dealer? Over half indicate they're going to the retailer to arrange a test drive, which is the third category. About third to 40% will actually drive the vehicle outside of the auto show experience. And so the show is proving exceptionally capable and valuable and consistently so, because we see this over the 3 years at least that we've been doing this with the Toronto Auto Show. It's driving behaviors that the OEMs and the dealers care about, and that is getting consumers excited and helping them make really good decisions.
Well, Darren, thanks for sharing those insights. I certainly like going, but it's nice to know there's a broader consumer interest for those that aren't really connected to the industry to do their shopping and to learn, in a vast warehouse or showroom, if you will, of all those vehicles. So thanks for sharing the findings today with us.
Oh, you're very welcome, and I appreciate the opportunity to do so.